3.5 years into what was supposed to be a few-day campaign to blitzkrieg through Ukraine, and Russia finds itself in quite a pickle. Russian President Vladimir Putin's grand strategy, after arguably fumbling an invasion that seemed a surefire victory, appears to be to engage in a pure war of attrition by numbers. In this regard, Russia is supposed to have a good shot of winning, considering it started the war with one of the largest arsenals of tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and even aircraft in the world. But what Putin doesn't seem to realize is that Russia's equipment is being culled at an alarming rate, with some analysts believing it could run out of armored vehicles and other vital equipment soon. Soon as in 2026. Of course, you might be bombarded with constant prognoses of when exactly Russia is going to have to cut the war short. So let's discuss just how much military equipment Russia has lost, what is left, and what that might mean for the future of the war in Ukraine, but also global geopolitics in general. Let's start with some hard numbers, helpfully provided by Oryx, an online database that meticulously tracks and records destroyed and damaged equipment on both sides of the conflict. According to their statistics, Russia has lost over 22,600 units of military equipment up to September 2025, which is roughly double that of Ukraine's own losses, even if it's a bit unfair to match them tit for tat. Of those, around 13,000 losses are solely for armored vehicles, including over 4,100 tanks that have been damaged or destroyed in the span of 42 months. And it should be noted that this was only what could be visually confirmed with satellite imagery, Ukraine's drone surveillance, and independent sources. The true scale of Russia's losses is likely to be at least a bit higher, given that a damaged or destroyed tank is pretty difficult to hide, with some analysts suggesting that visual records constitute between 80 and 90% of all equipment losses. These numbers are particularly impactful when we learn how many tanks Russia began with and what it's done since then to improve that number. According to the 2022 Military Balance Report from the International Institute for Strategic Studies, or IISS, Russia had around 3,300 tanks in active deployment at the start of the war, which were upgraded T-72, T-80 and T-90 tanks. However, the IISS had also suggested that Russia could have as many as 5,000 to 17,500 tanks in storage, mainly left over from the Soviet Union in various states of disrepair. That was at the start of the war. Even as early as May 2022, visual reports combined with Ukrainian military intelligence indicated that Russia had started pulling out older tanks from storage, with images of T-62s surfacing on the front line. At the time, some reports suggested Russia had already lost 1,000 tanks, but it's more fair to say that this was an exaggeration given the scale of losses that happened later. Further complicating the calculations is the fact that Russia never truly stopped producing new equipment or retrofitting old ones. By some estimates, Russia can produce around 250 contemporary tanks per year, meaning upgraded T-72s or later. Given that the war had lasted for 42 months, this would add another 800 or so tanks to the stockpile of more modern tanks that Russia had at its disposal to lose. And according to Oryx's count, roughly 3,100 of the tanks Russia lost were confirmed to be various versions of T-72s, T-80s and T-90s, with another 500 tanks that couldn't be properly identified. While it's uncertain how many of these tanks Russia had in storage before the war started, Ukraine is likely countering with around 1,500 contemporary tanks, where the rest are older designs that are simply being used as cannon fodder. And moving from reports of T-62s in 2022, Russia had been forced to deploy T-34s by November 2024, more than 2.5 years into the war. The T-34 is a model that was used in World War II. That should indicate just how dire the situation is. You have to pull a tank that's a literal museum piece out of storage, repair it, then send it off to a country that is using similar hardware to defend itself. Then there's another simple fact that Russia seems to need reminding of every so often. The equipment it's now using is likely the highest quality it will get. This is indicated by the slow but steady decline in both production and restoration. According to researchers from two prominent military analysis platforms, satellite imagery of storage and repair plants suggests Russia has reduced its capacity to refit tanks from over 120 per month at the beginning of 2022 to just 35 in mid-2025. The reason for this is simple. With over 5,000 tanks available in storage, the first ones pulled were in the best condition and needed the fewest repairs. But as Russia kept losing more tanks and its domestic production capacity was no match for this rate of loss, out came older tanks in more disrepair, which needed significantly more work. This was then compounded by Russia having to spend more and more money on obtaining the materials to make repairs, and as Ukraine's anti-tank tactics became more comprehensive and ruthless, Russia couldn't salvage nearly as many tanks from the front line to refit older pieces. The rate of tank attrition also paradoxically increases when there are fewer of them. According to the Ukrainian General Staff, Russia lost 1,000 armored vehicles per month in the first half of 2024, but over 3,000 monthly across the entire year by the end of it. The increased attrition rate is explained by the evolution of drone tactics to destroy tanks fully rather than disable or damage them, but also because there's simply less pressure provided on Ukraine by armored vehicles. If Ukraine's drone squads have more freedom to move inward to the front line, they can seek and destroy more tanks. Think of it like vaccination. The more armored vehicles and infantry support there are in the area, the less effective each drone attack is going to be due to compounding defenses and surveillance. But as more and more tanks get lost, the remaining ones are ripe for the picking off, and Ukraine can use bolder tactics to remove them. The IISS has delivered a devastating assessment. Russia will not have the sufficient main battle tanks to conduct effective offensive operations beyond early 2026 if it maintains the same operational tempo and suffers the same losses as in 2024. And we're already seeing that happening throughout the front. Russia has changed its battle tactics to rely on fewer and fewer armored vehicles. Even in 2023, Russia had reportedly started using human wave attacks, which included minimal to no armored vehicle support, with most of the attacks being extremely unsuccessful and practically decimating the Russian units involved. Instead of tanks, Russia has technologically devolved, using dirt bikes, scooters, World War II-era bikes with sidecars, and mopeds to get its soldiers closer to the line of fire. While it might seem funny when viewed from a distance, this sudden reversal to strategies that use vehicles with practically no protection or even significant mobility means that Russia is only going deeper into the pit of losing soldiers senselessly, which we'll discuss later in the video. But to understand the degradation of Russia's tank capabilities, it's also important to note why its best isn't nearly as effective as it should be. Take the so-called modern T-80 and T-90 tanks as the perfect example. On the surface, these tanks boast capabilities comparable to standard Western main battle tanks with reinforced and reactive armor designed to nullify damage from incoming explosive ordnance. But when you dig a bit deeper, you realize Russia has basically lied its way to the top of the best army leaderboard. The supposed reactive armor that the tanks come with might not be as effective as it seems, given that some tanks were discovered to be stocked with clay bricks or empty containers instead of the panels of the best-in-class relict era. The tank, which was once hailed as a mobile fortress and claimed to be practically impenetrable, seems to fall victim to good old-fashioned Russian corruption and propaganda. The Russian tanks are also surprisingly susceptible to the exact type of warfare Ukraine is leveraging, where strikes come from above rather than in front. You see, Russian tanks are designed with an auto-loader system built into the turret, which houses the spare ammunition nearby so that the system can fetch it and reload it faster than a human could. But that ammunition storage is protected by much thinner armor than the front-facing bulk of the tank. In traditional combat, this might not matter as much when bullets and ordnance are flying in a simple parabolic curve straight at the vehicle. But drones can maneuver around the armor and precisely target the vulnerable optics, engine compartments, or ammunition storage. This means that a single drone could, in theory, destroy an entire tank, especially when it's not protected against incoming ordnance, as its specifications would initially suggest. Then there's the fact that Russia has relied on parading a supposedly revolutionary tank that never saw combat, the T-14 Armata. When the first T-14 Armata strolled through Moscow in 2015, the statements that came out of the Kremlin were bold. Supposedly, Russia was well on its way to manufacturing hundreds of these new tanks per year, with the initial order of over 2,300 units between 2015 and 2020. A few years after that, the goalposts seem to have been moved to a mere 20 test units, with Russia proudly proclaiming that its current stock of T-90s was enough to deter threats from Germany, France, the US, and the UK, all of which use different Western tank designs that hail from a similar era. But after 3.5 years of war, there seems to be no sign of even the test vehicles anywhere near Ukraine. Initial reports from April 2023 suggested that Russia was finally deploying its most modern tank to the front line, or at least near it. But subsequent reports indicated that the heavily refitted tank, which included additional anti-drone protection, would only be used to test its armament and provide minimal fire support for existing campaigns. By September of that year, all reports seemed to corroborate that Russia had pulled all Armatas from Ukraine. While there's no official reasoning for this, the likely culprits are probably simple. 1. The tank's limited production run is estimated to be only 20 units, and it's unclear how many of those are fully outfitted for deployment. 2. The advanced technologies and armaments that the tank needed were likely too expensive to maintain in the long run, especially given that Russia was already struggling to repair its older tanks that were built on the exact paradigm of easy to use and repair from Soviet times. Finally, the tanks would ultimately prove to be rather useless on the grand scale of the war anyway, given that they were made for traditional vehicle-to-vehicle combat. They lacked dedicated drone protections and electronic warfare countermeasures, which were only explosively proliferated much later than the initial designs for the tank. If tanks tell one story of Russian depletion, artillery tells an even more humiliating one. According to a Reuters report, North Korea is supplying up to 100% of the artillery shells being used by several Russian artillery units in Ukraine. Let that sink in. The supposed second most powerful military in the world has at least 6 units entirely dependent on ammunition from one of the most isolated and impoverished nations on Earth. The report noted that North Korea had sent containers to Russia that could hold between 4 and 6 million artillery shells over the course of a year and a half. By comparison, Russia was estimated to have a domestic production of nearly 3 million artillery munitions per year, which is more than the entirety of NATO combined. And yet Russian forces are using approximately 10,000 shells per day, compared to 2,000 that Ukraine uses. This is roughly 3.65 million per year, more than domestic production. The Reuters report also suggested that the nominal production targets weren't met for 2024, with Russia producing only 2.3 million artillery shells, and that the first year of the war saw around 11 million shells being used, which likely depleted actual supplies. Missing a production target by roughly 25% could be seen as deadly when artillery was considered the one thing Russia had a decided advantage in when the war started to wind down and reach the attrition stage. The artillery, being able to shoot out of the range of smaller drones and damage vital infrastructure, meant that Russia would ideally be able to pressure out the Ukrainian military from its vantage points eventually. That didn't end up happening, and Russia ended up having to rely on North Korea for imports of both artillery and even people. But here's where it gets truly pathetic. Half of the North Korean shells don't even work. Ukrainian intelligence reports that these munitions were actually made in the 1970s and 80s and likely only partially inspected before being shipped from old stocks to Russia. Russia would then need to perform additional inspections to make sure that the artillery shells work, something that the military-industrial complex that's already ripping at the seams doesn't have the capacity for. North Korea seems to have gone the same route with Russia as Europe did with Ukraine. Toss out old equipment to an ally and hope it works. But there's a significant difference between the quality assurance of North Korea and that of Germany, France, the UK, Denmark, or any other NATO country that has spent years and millions of dollars maintaining equipment that was eventually donated to Ukraine. Russia has chosen to address this quality crisis with the most Russian solution possible, throwing even more terrible ammunition at the problem and hoping sheer quantity compensates for catastrophic quality control. Publicly available state documents revealed, Moscow is desperately rushing to complete a new TNT and RDX production facility in Siberia. It indicates that the existing supplies are low enough to be concerning. Meanwhile, the fact that the factory is some 1,800 miles east of Moscow is telling of how confident Russia is of its defenses, which is not much. Russia's aviation industry also faces what can only be described as a comprehensive collapse. A few months after the invasion started, the government indicated it could procure more than 1,000 new civil aircraft for airlines by 2030. But after 3 years of war, factories have produced only 5. The situation had become so bad that in 2025, the government cut aircraft production targets to a sliver of the initial promise and reduced spending on aircraft production due to ongoing delays and manufacturing challenges. The military aviation picture is even more concerning. RAND reported in 2024 that the Russian Air Force was likely flying at less than 75% of its pre-war capacity. The Russian Air Force was initially flying over 150 sorties per day, pushing the operational capacities of its older aircraft to their limit. As such, RAND estimated that Russia was actively losing a total of 60 aircraft just from their overuse and lack of proper maintenance. In contrast, the military complex can only procure around 25 new aircraft per year, including only 20 fighter jets, which have become go-to glide bomb lobbers as opposed to the air superiority assurance they were supposed to be. The civilian aviation crisis mixes in with the military problem to slowly compound the losses. While the two industries are technically separate, the spare parts, maintenance, and technologies that go inside the planes aren't. Russia, being under Western sanctions for over 3 years now, has drastically cut its access to the parts needed for both types of aircraft. Additionally, the lack of engineering capacity, compounded by the fact that people who could work in the industry are either dying in the war or fleeing the country en masse, means that Russia is already working overtime to replace Western planes with domestically produced aircraft. Ukraine has also been directly damaging Russia's ability to deploy its aircraft by targeting airports and air bases close to the border. This adds to the flight time needed for every sortie Russia undertakes. In addition, it forces Russia to use one of its other resources that it's starting to run out of: air defenses. The S-300 and less commonly the S-400 represent the pinnacle of Russia's anti-air defenses. Designed to detect and intercept NATO aircraft since the 1970s, both of these systems are starting to show their age. Despite being considered vital to Russian defenses, multiple S-300s and S-400 launchers and radars have been destroyed by Ukraine since the start of the war, with Oryx listing over 30 pieces visually confirmed and a total of over 340 surface-to-air missile systems destroyed since the start of the war. At the same time, exported S-300s proved to be entirely incapable of defending against more advanced Western threats. Israel reportedly managed to dismantle all 4 systems that Russia sold to Iran with seemingly no difficulties. Russia had also decided to change up some of its early strategies with mixed results. In early 2024, some S-300 systems and missiles were converted from air defense to ground attack. Russia has quietly shifted from using precision-guided cruise missiles to firing Soviet-era S-300 surface-to-air missiles at ground targets. This shift requires a significant overhaul of the missiles themselves, which use GPS tracking rather than heat signatures for aerial targeting. Additionally, the missiles need to be equipped with different types of warheads such as blast fragmentation or armor-piercing warheads, which are more effective against ground-based targets like shelters and bases. This sudden change points to one of 2 scenarios. First, Russia naively believed that it had enough domestic air defense systems to spare so it could devote a few to attack purposes. Second, and more likely, its domestic production of ground attack missiles plateaued and needed to be supplemented. Regardless, the accuracy of the reinvented S-300s was called into question as the system simply was not designed for the purpose. Whatever the case, the reality is that Russia had started to slowly but surely run out of air defense systems, as indicated by the fact that it had to pull systems all the way from Kaliningrad to serve closer bases. But beyond equipment shortages, Russia also faces a catastrophic human resource crisis that could be even more crippling. Russia planned to establish 15 new military training schools to address a critical shortage of officers, but only 2 of them were actually confirmed to be underway. At the same time, the military has lost over 1 million troops since the war started, making the war in Ukraine one of the deadliest conflicts in the 21st century by duration. The loss of life has cascaded into a manpower shortage for the rest of the country, which doubly impacts the military-industrial complex. Russian officials have reported a shortage ranging from 160,000 to 400,000 workers and engineers, with the most conservative estimate suggesting 80,000 engineers were needed just to maintain current production levels. Most telling is the demographic structure of the workers in the industry. The median age of military manufacturing employees was 45 in 2021, with only 16% under 29. This aging workforce, combined with massive casualties, creates a vicious cycle. Russia needs more equipment to replace battlefield losses, but lacks the skilled workers to increase production, while simultaneously losing the personnel who could either train or become new workers. All of these military shortages stem from a fundamental economic reality. Russia simply cannot afford to sustain this war much longer. Oil and gas revenues, Russia's primary income source, plummeted 35% year-over-year in May 2025, while defense spending now devours 40% of the entire federal budget. This creates an impossible situation. Russia must increase military spending to replace losses, but its primary revenue sources are declining due to sanctions and global market shifts. The Kremlin has already signaled spending cuts starting in 2026, essentially admitting Russia can't sustain the current tempo. What we're witnessing isn't simply equipment shortages or budget constraints. Russia has been firing on all cylinders since 2022 after initially bungling to take over Ukraine in a matter of weeks. It has systematically underestimated Ukraine's defensive potential and the level of donations the West would procure as soon as it got a whiff of the war lasting long enough to settle into a stage of attrition. From the West's view, donations mean it can offload equipment to Ukraine that it was already going to disassemble. That equipment would then cripple Russian industrial potential, and any new developments made by Western military complexes get a real-life testing ground directly on the Ukrainian front line, speeding up research significantly. It's an economic win-win for NATO. Unless an expected shift occurs, hostilities could gradually fade by late 2025 or early 2026 due to shortages of tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery. Russia would be hard-pressed to make a few major advances to maintain the illusion of power before the year rolls over, or it could lose the few allies it currently has. This leaves Putin with several tough choices. He can either dramatically scale back military operations to preserve remaining equipment, or continue the current intensity and face complete equipment exhaustion by 2026. Or Russia could decide to approach peace discussions without subterfuge, something that would degrade its domestic power to the point that it might be ousted by the very system it built. Thanks for watching. To understand how Ukraine has managed to systematically destroy Russia's military capabilities, check out our analysis of Ukraine's innovative drone warfare tactics. And to stay up to date with the evolution of modern warfare and global military analyses, subscribe to The Military Show for daily videos.